a Zoom meeting with the college, actually.
Oh, how did it go?
Good.
Yeah? There's still going to be one?
What
I was teasing. I said there's still going to be a college?
happened? Surprisingly.
Yeah, right. Hey, did you have a chance to do any writing on the Surviving with Class project?
Yeah, I actually have a document open on it. I just need to finish, I think, one or two paragraphs, and I'll be good, and I'll send it to you.
Awesome. Hi, Lena.
Hi.
Hi, Deanna.
Hi, Mr. Preston.
So, speaking of surviving with class, I just got a great idea from one of the other teachers in the English department. Do any of you know Miss Delgadillo?
No.
Okay. We were just in a meeting together and she mentioned, it would be great to have some artwork in this book. And I know Lily's doing some painting. She mentioned that early on. So if anybody's artistically inclined, or if anybody wants to do an oral interview, like with your parents or your grandparents, and just record it and send it to me as a recording, we can do that too. And I'll put some stuff up on the blog for that. But I just wanted to include those creative options because I thought they were cool ideas. So with that being said, I want to let you know, so yesterday we broke the streak. I had 32 Zoom meetings in a row on weekdays since school closed, and yesterday was the first time that I had to put up that message. And I wanted to let you know why. Did you read the blog yesterday?
Yeah, it was because of the meeting, wasn't it?
Well, not exactly. I was asked to go to school to submit grade change forms for each and every single student I teach because apparently, well, who knows why. But bottom line, that wasn't the reason I was not able to be on Zoom. What happened when I got there was a huge and very unkind surprise. I turned the corner from that little parking lot on Stoll to go to the 600s where our room is. And right there at the corner, there were security guards and a few homeless people because the school is a shelter. But no one was wearing a mask. No one was 6 feet apart. And because they were literally right behind the corner, I couldn't see them until I was right there. So I had to spend time, first of all, taking a wider route every other time I passed by. But then also I had to take time and get my clothes clean and myself clean and everything else before I could get in front of my computer. So I thought I was going to be able to rush home and be on time, but there was just no way. And it got me thinking about the fall. And I know that we've talked about this. I really hope that things go well and we can all get back to the life that we once thought was normal. And if that's the way 7 people are on campus, I cannot imagine for the life of me what it's going to be like with 3,000. So what I put on the blog was, it's not my job to make a recommendation about this kind of thing one way or the other, but I do care about everybody I know as people. So I haven't heard anything official from the district about the fall. I don't know what they're planning, but it sure would be nice for you and your families to have some peace of mind about this. So my recommendation on the blog was that you start a conversation at home and see about reaching out to see if you can get some information from the district, because I haven't gotten any yet. So that was my 2 cents about that. Any questions about anything before we get into the book?
Wait, you were saying, oh, sorry. You were saying you went grade change. Is it because we had an option to do credit or no credit? Did we have to let you know which one we wanted still?
No, you're totally fine. And everybody on this call has an A. There's no question in my book. I think I've already told you that. No, the issue was the only time that my internet glitched out since I've been home with the school being closed was on the very day that grades were due on Aries. And as soon as I figured out the glitch and fixed it, I sent a message with grade rosters. But somebody in the administration told me that, no, Dr. Preston, you have to come to school or somehow manage to fill out 170 something individual forms for each one of your students. And I really don't know why that was necessary, but I'm always going to do what I need to for my students. So that's what I did.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen because we've got on the course blog, I put up a post about Catch-22. And first of all, before I go on, I also want to let you know, if you were a person who was interested in one of the other books on that list, you are more than welcome to read and do a literature analysis. And if you even want, I will be happy to join you online for an individual Zoom call if you want to talk about whether, I think it was Emma who was interested in The Secret Life of Bees. Somebody else mentioned a write-in vote actually for The Secret Garden. And the rest of us were kind of interested in this one. So I just want to let you know you have options. So today, and I'm reading from the blog right now, we'll start reading Catch-22. And this book really was the first of its kind. It became so famous that the phrase Catch-22 became part of the English language. It's actually a descriptor for any time someone finds themselves between two decisions that don't go together, and I'll explain more about that. Before that phrase, there wasn't really a way to describe that. And here's the passage that made that famous. There was only one catch, and that was Catch-22, which specified that a concern for one's own safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind, or was crazy and could be grounded. All he had to do was ask. And as soon as he did, he would no longer be crazy and would have to fly more missions, or would be crazy to fly more missions and sane if he didn't. But if he was sane, he had to fly them. If he flew, he was crazy and didn't have to. But if he didn't want to, he was sane and then he had to. Yossarian was moved very deeply by the absolute simplicity of this clause of Catch-22 and let out a respectful whistle. Now, before I go on, let's put it in real phrases. Let's say that you were a student and you said, it's absolutely, let's say that there was a policy on campus that said you cannot come to school if you're crazy. It would be very politically incorrect to say that, but just for argument's sake. And let's say that the only people who wanted to go to school in the pandemic were crazy. Well, Catch-22 says, if you're crazy, you're not allowed at school. But if you don't want to go to school, you're sane, and then you have to go to school. You see how you're caught?
Yeah, caught both ways.
Okay. And the reason you're caught is because that policy is ridiculous. It's not the person's fault. It's just that you've heard the saying, damned if you do and damned if you don't. This is it.
Yeah.
So to come back to the book, George Patton, who was a very famous United States Army general in World War II, once said, compared to war, all other forms of human endeavor shrink to insignificance. Whatever people think of war, they don't usually think to make fun of it. I mean, when you think about the number of war movies and war stories and how everyone, especially in our culture, seems to define themselves by, even if you think someone is the biggest schmuck on the planet, but they're wearing a uniform, it's still, and thank you for your service. And there's a lot of honor in that. I come from multiple generations of armed services. I have a deep understanding of that. But as we talked about on Tuesday, this book, the first of its kind, is a satire set in World War II. So instead of viewing the topic as heroic, savage, or even serious, author Joseph Heller applies logic and the keen observation of an omniscient third-person narrative to point out the absurdity of it all. It still seems strange to use the words war and funny in connection with each other, but Heller is skillful, and his tone has a purpose. As with all satire, expressing anger through humor has the potential to point out what's wrong in the world and move the reader to support improvement. And as I wrote this, it's true, I'd like to imagine that somewhere, someone is writing a satire right now about this crazy moment in American history. So this link is to Wikipedia, and that'll give you some background on the author and the book. And here, and I'm gonna go ahead and click on this one, is the actual text of the book for free, posted thankfully by some other teacher somewhere. And I don't know much about her because the rest of her website is kind of blank. I said that I will be using a well-worn copy. Can you see what I'm holding up?
Yeah.
Okay. And I was actually, sorry?
It's torn, or is
Yeah.
that part of it?
It's torn. It's being held together by tape. It looks like some of our textbooks in class. The only difference is, and I said that I inherited from my dad, I was wrong. This is actually from my mom, but when she was in college, this was her book. So let me get back to our full view here. And if you want to, you can follow along with the text on that site. That's why I put up the PDF. Also, just like Fahrenheit 451, you can go ahead or go back over anything that you feel like you missed. I'm just going to start at the beginning with the first line of the book. And I love first lines of books, especially this one, because the book is about war, right? It's all about death and conflict and awfulness. So what does the first line say? It was love at first sight. The first time Yossarian saw the chaplain, he fell madly in love with him. Now you got to remember, this was also in the 1950s. This was published around the same time as Fahrenheit 451. A man falling in love with another man, especially love in the time of war. The whole book starts off with the reader designed to go, what? Yossarian was in the hospital with a pain in his liver that fell just short of being jaundice. The doctors were puzzled by the fact that it wasn't quite jaundice. If it became jaundice, they could treat it. If it didn't become jaundice and went away, they could discharge him. But this just being short of jaundice all the time confused them. Each morning they came around, 3 brisk and serious men with efficient mouths and inefficient eyes, accompanied by brisk and serious Nurse Duckett, one of the ward nurses who didn't like Yossarian. They read the chart at the foot of the bed and asked impatiently about the pain. They seemed irritated when he told them it was exactly the same. Still no movement? The full colonel demanded. The doctors exchanged a look when he shook his head. Give him another pill. Nurse Duckett made a note to give Yossarian another pill, and the 4 of them moved along to the next bed. None of the nurses liked Yossarian. Actually, the pain in his liver had gone away, but Yossarian didn't say anything, and the doctors never suspected. They just suspected that he had been moving his bowels and not telling anyone. Yossarian had everything he wanted in the hospital. The food wasn't too bad, and his meals were brought to him in bed. There were extra rations of fresh meat, and during the hot part of the afternoon, he and the others were served chilled fruit juice or chilled chocolate milk. Apart from the doctors and the nurses, no one ever disturbed him. For a little while in the morning, he had to censor letters, but he was free after that to spend the rest of each day lying around idly with a clear conscience. He was comfortable in the hospital, and it was easy to stay on because he always ran a temperature of 101. He was even more comfortable than Dunbar, who had to keep from falling down on his face in order to get his meals brought to him in bed. So they're all faking being sick to get out of battle. After he made up his mind to spend the rest of the war in the hospital, Yossarian wrote letters to everyone he knew saying that he was in the hospital, but never mentioning why. One day he had a better idea. To everyone he knew, he wrote that he was going on a very dangerous mission. They asked for volunteers. It's very dangerous, but someone has to do it. I'll write you the instant I get back. And he had not written anyone since. All the officer patients in the ward were forced to censor letters written by all the enlisted men patients who were kept in residence in wards of their own. Do you know what that means? Anyone want to guess what it meant to censor the letters?
Isn't censored to mean like take out information that like they don't want the outside world knowing or something like that?
Exactly. So when the enlisted soldiers would write letters, the officers would read them before they would hit the mail. And if they held anything that was classified or just that the Army didn't want in there, then they would cross it out. It was a monotonous job. And Yossarian was disappointed to learn that the lives of enlisted men were only slightly more interesting than the lives of officers. After the first day, he had no curiosity at all. To break the monotony, he invented games. Death to all modifiers, he declared one day, and out of every letter that passed through his hands went every adverb and every adjective. The next day, he made war on articles. He reached a much higher plane of creativity the following day when he blacked out everything in the letters but a, an, and the. That erected more dynamic interlinear tensions, he felt, and in just about every case left the message far more universal. Soon he was prescribing parts of salutations and signatures and leaving the text untouched. One time he blacked out all but the salutation. I'm laughing, but this is horrible. He blacked out all but the salutation, Dear Mary, from the letter, and at the bottom he wrote, I yearn for you tragically, A.T. Tapman, Chaplain, U.S. Army. A.T. Tapman was the group chaplain's name. So some poor soldier's girlfriend or wife got a letter that said, "Dear Mary," and then the whole thing was blacked out, and it said, "I yearn for you tragically," from the chaplain. When he had exhausted all possibilities in the letters, he began attacking the names and addresses on the envelopes, obliterating whole homes and streets, annihilating entire metropolises with careless flicks of his wrist as though he were God. Catch-22 required that each censored letter bear the censoring officer's name. Most letters he didn't read at all. On those he didn't read at all, he wrote his own name. On those he did read, he wrote Washington Irving. When that grew monotonous, he wrote Irving Washington. Who was Washington Irving? Does anyone remember? This is an allusion. It's a reference to something the reader should know. Ichabod Crane. Does that give it away?
No, wait.
No. Halloween. The legend of 14-year-old knows it. Shout it out.
Sleepy Hollow?
Yep, 14-year-old nailed it. Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
I've never heard of that.
What? The Headless Horseman?
I
Oh,
don't think I've heard of
well, you're going to have to do 11th grade over so we can spend Halloween together next year.
that.
Censoring the envelopes, he had serious repercussions, produced a ripple of anxiety on some ethereal military echelon that floated a CID man back into the ward posing as a patient. They all knew he was a CID man because he kept inquiring about an officer named Irving or Washington. And because after his first day, he wouldn't censor letters. He found them too monotonous. Monotonous is a synonym for boring. It was a good ward this time, one of the best he and Dunbar had ever enjoyed, which suggests they've done this before. With them this time was the 24-year-old fighter pilot captain with a sparse golden mustache who had been shot into the Adriatic Sea in midwinter and had not even caught cold. Now the summer was upon them. The captain had not been shot down, and he said he had the grip. In the bed on Yossarian's right, still lying amorously on his belly, was the startled captain with malaria in his blood and a mosquito bite on his ass. Across the aisle from Yossarian was Dunbar, and next to Dunbar was the artillery captain with whom Yossarian had stopped playing chess. The captain was a good chess player, and the games were always interesting. Yossarian had stopped playing chess with him because the games were so interesting they were foolish. Then there was the educated Texan from Texas who looked like someone in Technicolor and felt, patriotically, that people of means, decent folk, should be given more votes than drifters, whores, criminals, degenerates, atheists, and indecent folk, people without means. People with money having more power than people without. Interesting. Yossarian was unspringing rhythms in the letters the day they brought the Texan in. It was another quiet, hot, untroubled day. The heat pressed heavily on the roof, stifling sound. Dunbar was lying motionless on his back again with his eyes staring up at the ceiling like a doll's. He was working hard at increasing his lifespan. He did it by cultivating boredom. Dunbar was working so hard at increasing his lifespan that Yossarian thought he was dead. Why do you think that sentence works? Why does that idea work for you? He was increasing his lifespan by cultivating boredom. We'll finish this saying, time flies when you're
Having fun.
right. So if you're not having fun, time seems to glow how fast?
Not fast.
Right. So if you can just make yourself bored, you can live forever.
Oh.
Thinks this guy, which really bodes well for everybody because the last month or two, from what I'm hearing from all of you guys, you should live to about 175. They put the Texan in a bed in the middle of the ward, and it wasn't long before he donated his views. Dunbar sat up like a shot. "That's it," he cried excitedly. "There was something missing. All the time I knew there was something missing, and now I know what it is." He banged his fist down into his palm. "No patriotism," he declared. "You're right," Yossarian shouted back. "You're right, you're right, you're right. The hot dog, the Brooklyn Dodgers, Mom's apple pie. That's what everyone's fighting for. But who's fighting for the decent folk? Who's fighting for more votes for the decent folk? There is no patriotism, that's what it is. And no matriotism either. If it's patriotism, it's masculine, right? Like the patriarch of the family is the father.
Yeah.
Patriotism would be the mom. I promise you, this Texan didn't care about women's rights. So basically, Yossarian and Dunbar are making fun of the guy right in front of the face. The warrant officer on Yossarian's left was unimpressed. Who gives a shit? He asked tiredly, and turned over on his side to go to sleep. The Texan turned out to be good-natured, generous, and likable. In 3 days, no one could stand him. He sent shudders of annoyance scampering up ticklish spines, and everybody fled from him. Everybody but the soldier in white, who had no choice. The soldier in white was encased from head to toe in plaster and gauze. He had 2 useless legs and 2 useless arms. He had been smuggled into the ward during the night, and the men had no idea he was among them until they awoke in the morning and saw the 2 strange legs hoisted from the hips, the 2 strange arms anchored up perpendicularly, all 4 limbs pinioned strangely in the air by lead weights suspended darkly above him that never moved. Sewn into the bandages over the insides of both elbows were zippered lips through which he was fed clear fluid from a clear jar. A silent zinc pipe rose from the cement on his groin and was coupled to a slim rubber hose that carried waste from his kidneys and dripped it, efficiently, into a clear stoppered jar on the floor. When the jar on the floor was full, the jar feeding his elbow was empty, and the 2 were simply switched quickly so that stuff could drip back into him. All they ever really saw of the soldier in white was a frayed black hole over his mouth. The soldier in white had been filed next to the Texan, and the Texan sat sideways on his own bed and talked to him throughout the morning, afternoon, and evening in a pleasant, sympathetic drawl. The Texan never minded that he got no reply. Temperatures were taken twice a day in the ward. Early each morning and late each afternoon, Nurse Kramer entered with a jar full of thermometers and worked her way up one side of the ward and down the other, distributing a thermometer to each patient. She managed the soldier in white by inserting a thermometer into the hole over his mouth and leaving it balanced there on the lower rim. When she returned to the man in the first bed, she took his thermometer and recorded his temperature, and then moved on to the next bed and continued around the ward again. One afternoon, when she had completed her first circuit and came a second time to the soldier in white, she read his thermometer and discovered that he was dead. Murderer, Dunbar said quietly. The Texan looked up at him with an uncertain grin. Killer, Yossarian said. What are you fellows talking about? The Texan asked nervously. You murdered him, said Dunbar. You killed him, said Yossarian. The Texan shrank back. You fellows are crazy. I didn't even touch him. You murdered him, said Dunbar. I heard you kill him, said Yossarian. You killed him because he was a nigger, Dunbar said. In the book, reading it line by line. You fellows are crazy, the Texan cried. They don't allow niggers in here. They got a special place for niggers. The sergeant smuggled him in, Dunbar said. The communist sergeant, said Yossarian, and you knew it. The warrant officer on Yossarian's left was unimpressed by the entire incident of the soldier in white. The warrant officer was unimpressed by everything and never spoke at all unless it was to show irritation. The day before Yossarian met the chaplain, a stove exploded in the mess hall and set fire to one side of the kitchen. An intense heat flashed through the area. Even in Yossarian's ward, almost 300 feet away, they could hear the roar of the blaze and the sharp cracks of flaming timber. And before I go on, because this is a fairly large paragraph, I want to talk about that dialogue. Did you catch a few paragraphs ago a mention of the Brooklyn Dodgers when they were talking about patriotism?
Yeah.
Yeah? Well, what is that team known as now? There's still the Dodgers.
LA Dodgers.
Yeah, they moved from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. So technically, when I read Brooklyn Dodgers, that doesn't exist. And if it does, it's incorrect to say so. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with using a derogatory term for African Americans that, fortunately, in the time since this book was published to now, would not likely be included and certainly wouldn't be a part of our speech. And as an artifact of when this was written, I also think it's important to have integrity, which is why I read it the way it's printed on the page. In about 15 minutes, the crash trucks from the airfield arrived to fight the fire. For a frantic half hour, it was touch and go. Then the firemen began to get the upper hand. Suddenly, there was the monotonous old drone of bombers returning from a mission, and the firemen had to roll up their hoses and speed back to the field in case one of the planes crashed and caught fire. The planes landed safely. As soon as the last one was down, the firemen wheeled their trucks around and raced back up the hill to resume their fight with the fire at the hospital. When they got there, the blaze was out. It had died of its own accord, expired completely without even an ember to be watered down, and there was nothing for the disappointed firemen to do but drink tepid coffee and hanging around trying to screw the nurses. The chaplain arrived the day after the fire. Yossarian was busy expurgating all but romance words from the letters when the chaplain sat down in a chair between the beds and asked him how he was feeling. He had placed himself a bit to one side, and the captain's bars on the tab of his shirt collar were all the insignia Yossarian could see. Yossarian had no idea who he was, and just took it for granted that he was either another doctor or another madman. Now, when you see most traditional stories about war, and you think about how soldiers are depicted, is madman a word that you would use to describe them?
Not typically, no.
No, it would be more like hero, right?
Yeah.
So from the very beginning, as we've read these first few pages, the way that the author looks at soldiers, well, let me ask you this. How would you describe the author's tone when it comes to the characters?
I can't tell like the tone. I just feel like he sees them as like really weak because they all like are cowards, kind of like faking their sickness to stay inside the hospital so they don't have to go out anywhere. While he was like writing that letter how he has to go on some secret mission, very dangerous, and then like never wrote anyone again.
Yeah, he seems like a jerk.
Yeah.
So you have people who are not the Hollywood big screen image of the soldier, right? You have people that are portrayed as being afraid, people who are trying to get out of their duty by faking being sick or faking being hurt, people who are not taking their responsibilities seriously, or worse, just breaking the rules to mess with things, pilots hanging around trying to hook up with the nurses. On one hand, this seems like a complete tossing upside down of every stereotype when I think of, soldiers in war. At the same time, this seems to me to be more human and more like the people I've met in my life than any other portrayal of soldiers in war I've ever seen either. What do you guys think about that? I mean, think of the students you know. Does everybody get an assignment and say, onward with fidelity?
No.
No.
Yeah, I don't think so. All right. So we're going to leave it there as a beginning for today. What I'm going to do is take a look at our calendar and how many pages we've got, and I'm going to start encouraging some reading in between sessions. But for today, we can leave it that. I'm going to put up a blog post that just kind of like reintroduces what we read today. And in the meantime, I'll also start encouraging you to send me stuff as soon as you're ready. And Deanna, I'm going to get to yours this afternoon and send you some thoughts.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow at 1 o'clock.
You too.
Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.